Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and today we're continuing our series talking about Tibet. And with us, I'm very happy to say, very privileged to have Jamyang Norbu, who wants me to introduce him as a political activist and a writer, which doesn't begin to really, it's all true, but doesn't begin to do justice to the fact that the man's given his entire life to the cause of Tibetan freedom, including, and I know you probably consider this a minor footnote in your story, but including running off to join the Tibetan resistance as a young man, uh, which in old American stories, there's always a kid who runs off to join the circus. I think it takes a lot. I think it takes a lot more guts to run off to join an armed resistance to the communist Chinese in Mustang. But anyway, welcome, sir.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
So, one of the things we do on Ground Truth is, we try to provide bedrock. We try to provide facts in a media that's increasingly dominated by nothing but hyperbole and screaming and emotion. We try to actually give people an opportunity to understand really what's going on. So this whole series that we're doing focused on Tibet, which at this point I have no idea how many portions that is, maybe an indefinite number, is kind of focused that way. And the first episode that we did about a week ago was sort of a broad horizon, here's the Tibetan question writ large sort of thing. Because of your unique perspective, what I'd really like to focus on today, and you and I obviously have talked in advance about this, is go back to the origins of the Chinese occupation, the Chinese invasion of Tibet, and then focusing on the resistance and really not just the resistance, but I mean, in many cases, the armed resistance on the Tibetan side to this question, to this action. So let's go back in time to the end of the Second World War. It's 1945. I mean, and the years following. And Tibet is a completely independent country. Let's just establish that, because that Chinese lie that that's not true is still out there. And what is the situation in Tibet? I mean, the rest of the world is kind of flattened. What's going on in Tibet?
Yeah, the rest of the world, and in particular China, is completely flattened. They not only had the Japanese invasion, but they had a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. Millions of people were killed, millions dislocated, and Japan was flattened. But Tibet was relatively prosperous at the time. It had not been affected by the war, and the Tibetan government had actually formally declared itself to be a neutral country. And had told all the British and the Americans and the Chinese also that that was its position. And when actually the Americans and the British wanted to supply China after the Japanese invaded Burma, and they had to keep up their supplies to China, and they hadn't yet built the Burma Road, they asked if they could build a road through Tibet. And the Tibetan government says, no, you can't do that. But what it'll do, for humanitarian reasons, is it'll allow transport of medical and other sort of humanitarian goods through Tibet on mule bike, because there's a very big trade earlier between all these areas. And so a lot of American medical products and other things got to China through Tibet. So that was a Tibetan government concession. For that, actually, President Roosevelt sent two of his envoys to Tibet. And they presented the young Dalai Lama with, his presence. And they talked to the Tibetan cabinet, and they got these concessions. But at the same time, the Tibetans, to demonstrate their neutrality, they even gave, asylum to two escaped prisoners of war from India. These were Austrian climbers, mountain climbers, who had been arrested just as war broke out, and they were, interned in an Indian large concentration camp near the Himalayas. And these two people escaped. Actually, three did to Tibet. One went back. And they stayed, and one of them wrote this famous book, 7 Years in Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tibet's position was, in some ways, it wasn't a fuzzy one. It was something that actually, even by international law, this is what the nationalist Chinese accepted. They were very angry, but they had to put up with this. And the Tibetans are doing economically relatively well because, with World War II, Japanese submarines had cut off Australia. So American supply of wool had dried up. And so there was a big demand for Tibetan wool. And pretty soon, Detroit, like the car industry discovered that Tibetan sheep wool was very tough. And the days before you had nylon and things, for motor car carpets and things, it was ideal. It wasn't just soft wool. So there was a big demand. Tibetans were quite a few $1 million. There was coming in every year to, according even to the American consulate accounts that I managed to get from Calcutta, where the Americans had a consulate general. And they were doing well, and also supplying goods, and as we earlier talked about, to China. And we are not only supplying medical stuff, but we are also supplying goods that were needed by the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese, in their capital in Chongqing, what they call it these days. And the Japanese had completely cut off China from the sea. So, and all nationalist, Chinese officers needed their whiskey and their champagne. So we were supplying them all through Kalimpong. So there was a huge trade in watches and pens and whiskeys and brandies, ladies' perfumes, and this and that. And Tibetans, they were making a killing. Not only just rich merchants, but everyone on the way. People who were supplying pack animals, people who were supplying feed and fodder, and people people who were just providing little rooms for the mule traders and things. So it was an enormously kind of wonderful time for Tibetans. But unfortunately, this was the Tibetan government. Had many faults, but the worst was its kind of it wasn't up to date on so many things in the world. When the United Nations, were first kind of, organized, and like they had, there was certain meeting. I think this from San Francisco and then later to New York. Tibetans actually applied to join, but then the Chinese objected, and the Chinese had a seat in the Security Council. And this China was, the nationalist Chinese. And afterwards, the national Chinese had to leave China, and they were in Taiwan. And there they were even threatened by the communists. But nonetheless, they never supported the Tibetan issue. So then Tibet gradually, like after the Civil War finished in China, the nationalists had fled China. And then the Chinese started announcing that it would what they called liberate Tibet and Taiwan from Western imperialist forces, and also they included Hong Kong in it. But the
So this is a key point that I just want to emphasize, because again, what we're trying to do here is educate, remind people. Okay. So China begins to announce that now we're talking communist China after the Civil War's over, and as you said, the nationalist government has fled to Taiwan, where it remains to this day. And the Chinese begin to make these threatening noises toward Tibet. And they, from the very outset, because I think this is so critical, because I think it's at the core of how this communist regime works. They don't even have the decency to say, hey, we're going to invade this completely independent country and separate culture and conquer it. From the beginning, we begin with a lie. We're going to liberate Tibet. We're somehow, like, when we're all done conquering you, you need to thank us, I guess, is the
absolutely,
audacity. And that's the way they put it from the beginning, right?
And it was liberation from American and European uh, uh, imperialism. That was the term. And the thing was, in Tibet, you didn't have American or European, let's say, colonialists or imperialists. You had the British representative, one person, with his Indian staff, and Tibetan staff. And you had two former Austrian POWs who were working for the Tibetan government, were minor clerics, and that's about it. But nonetheless, that was their rhetoric. And, it was Tibet, Taiwan, and what was also included in a very subtle way, intimated to the British, was Hong Kong was going to be liberated, because Hong Kong belonged to China. But the thing was, the British made a deal, and this is what Tibetans not only they believe that there was a kind of quid pro quo, and this had happened with the British in China before, even in imperial times, in the previous centuries. So there was a kind of British, actually in Parliament, there was debates about whether Hong Kong would have to be handed back. Now the Chinese are demanding it. And the Hong Kong administration, they had prepared evacuation to Australia. The entire administration, everything was done. The British knew that they had to leave. But then I think it was the foreign ministry in Britain, and from Whitehall, they had struck a deal. And it appears now, I mean, none of us were there when they made this deal, but it appears in the end that the whole thing was a quid pro quo, that in recognition, in some ways, that if Britain wanted to keep Hong Kong, it would have to give up its kind of support for Tibet. Earlier, Britain gave a rather lukewarm support to the idea of Tibetan independence or suzerainty, as they called it. They were always, like on this, they played games. So there was this quid pro quo, and Britain actually, when Tibet appealed to the United Nations, Britain did not support. Britain was the only country that actually maintained diplomatic relations with Tibet. It enjoyed privileges, trade privileges, a number of privileges. It had signed 2 or 3 treaties with Tibet, and as their last representative to the to Lhasa, a diplomat called Hugh Richardson, I had met actually when he was very old, and he came out clearly, and he was very angry. He said the British sold the Tibetans down the river. He used this term. And for that, he was really, although he was a senior diplomat, and he was the leading expert on Tibet in the world at that time, he was never given any honors. Everyone who retired from that position usually gets, some kind of knighthood or whatever. He got nothing. There was no recognition.
Yeah. Well, that's the price you pay for telling the truth.
Yeah, and
when they wanted you to keep your mouth shut, but you actually spoke up and had courage.
So and then, then 49 came when the Chinese completely took over entire kind of China. They had at the time, because of the Civil War, they had a standing army of 5 million soldiers, at that time. And, this is on record. And they soon got, after the 1 million died during the Korean War, but, at the time before they were invading Tibet. And, of course, they had problems trying to invade Tibet. They contacted Stalin. Mao went to, when Russia, and he discussed this with Stalin, and it's on record. He asked Stalin for help for Chinese supply planes and bombers, because he wanted, it was hard to get into Tibet because of the terrain.
Right.
And they hadn't built roads yet, but they needed to get supplies in. And you can't get a large army in those areas. It's a disaster. The Chinese knew it.
Right.
During the long march, they really suffered in those areas,
Right.
So Stalin helped them out. And actually, the word Stalin did tell them, you have to take care of this Tibetan. You can't keep that running sore, next to you. You have to take over. And he said, flood Tibet with the Chinese people later, settle area. And so when the invasion started, the Tibetan government had, the Governor General in Eastern Tibet had 8 regiments, it's around 8,000 soldiers, troops, and maybe 2,000 or 3,000 local militia from the Kampas in Eastern Tibet. and they were defending a very long line. But earlier, even British military advisors who had come to Tibet had told Tibetans, you cannot keep a long defense like that, and spread your troops out in penny packets.
Mm-hmm.
It's better that you just keep outposts on the frontier, pull your main regiments back, at least a day or two, journey, and then when the Chinese invade, and you have some idea of what's going on, where they're headed, what their strategy is, then you can concentrate your troops and fight back. They said, and this was actually, it's on record also. My grandfather was in the cabinet at the time in Lhasa, and he remembered this advice being given. And so Tibetans, as weak as we were, they were all prepared to fight. And we were reasonably well armed. The standard weapon was the British Lee Enfield rifle that all Tibetans had. And even we had bought a lot of it from the Brits. We had to pay. The British never gave anything free. All had to pay for in silver. But, nonetheless, we had it. And the only problem was, the Governor General of Eastern Tibet, who was not only ran the civil administration, but even the military, was initially a young Tibetan aristocrat called Halu. And he was, he was someone who knew what he was doing. Although he was going to retreat, and that was the plan, and fall back, they had a much better and more secure, rather than the capital of Eastern Tibet at the time, which is called Chamdo, which is the largest town, which is quite vulnerable, They were going to withdraw about 2 or 3 days march to a place just by the Mekong River, the upstream, and very tight, and from there, the Chinese wouldn't have really been able to do much there. So that was their kind of fallback position, and they had artillery, everything there. They couldn't bring it up there. They didn't want to. But the problem was really, this Governor General's term had come up. And just on the eve of the Chinese invasion, a new Governor General came. Very charming person, but someone who the Chinese had worked on before. Certain Chinese had tried to persuade him that it was the Chinese were not really interested in taking over Tibet. All they wanted to do was liberate it, from Western imperialists and blah blah. The whole spiel.
Yes.
So he felt for that, and when the Chinese attack started, two or three generals on the front line, they actually fought very well. It's quite unbelievable when you see, in the front line, initial place where the Chinese attacked, 20,000 troops attacked a small little position across the river, which is being held by about 200 or 300 Tibetans. And these people managed to fight for at least 3 days. I'm not sure how. Eventually, they were wiped out. One person was captured, and he gave a report actually too. And there was one eyewitness at the time, there was a very young British radio operator in Tibet who was training Tibetan radio operators, and he himself was the chief radio operator. And he was captured by the Chinese, and he wrote a book later called Captured in Tibet. And he talks about this, And the Tibetans on the frontier, they kept on fighting but retreating, as was planned earlier, So it was quite effective. The Chinese were quite unsure in all this terrain. So Tibetans always managed to retreat and pull back quite successfully, except one regiment that exposed itself a little too much. It was wiped out. But most others retreated in pretty good form. But then the Governor General of Eastern Tibet, this person called Ngabe, who later became he was a great favorite with the Chinese, he surrendered he had 2-3 regiments with him. He surrendered. And that was a big deal for the Chinese. They immediately treated him really well. They asked him to give a speech to the Chinese.
Sure, of course, yeah.
And then they took him back to Chamdo. They treated him really well, and then they started working on it, what they call later, brainwashing,
Yep.
indoctrination, every nightly, many hours, intense. But then the former Governor General had not completely returned to Lhasa. He had managed to, he had his kind of bodyguards, and he had a regiment or two at this place called Hodzong, where there was a very big Tibetan kind of fortress. And then he managed to capture all the, collect all the Tibetan troops that had been scattered over eastern Tibet, after the Governor General had surrendered. And he managed to actually collect about 3 regiments. And then slowly, he pulled back in good order, keeping up his defense. And the Chinese tried to capture him, but they finally could not. And he managed gradually pulling back, sometimes attacking the Chinese. And in one battle, they even managed to, destroy a couple of Chinese companies. 200 or 300 Chinese were completely killed in a surprise attack. But then he pulled back. He never really, I think he didn't overdo it. He was a very good general in that sense. And he finally pulled back about 150 miles from Lhasa. There's a postal station called Kongba Jamta next to a river. And then he set up his final defense there. And from Lhasa, there was, of course, earlier there was panic. And so the old regent, he resigned. It was just not a very efficient government, rather corrupt, but he resigned, and the young Dalai Lama came to power, which is about 17 or 18 at the time. And then the cabinet actually took the Dalai Lama, and they shifted all the way to the Indian border, in Sikkim. There's a Tibetan town there for his safety. But then before they left, what they did was they appointed, and I think that was one of the best things they did. They appointed 2 very, middle-ranking officials, very old gentlemen of the old school, into power. They were made into prime ministers, and they were given entire kind of power, administrative power over Tibet. And they were told, and these guys were very good, extremely able administratively, courageous, and far-thinking. And they, at once, where the Tibetan, earlier the old Governor General had set up his defense, they at once contacted him and they said, they're sending troops there. They said they started recruiting forming new regiments in Lhasa and sending it there. And it was quite powerful there, And the Chinese, by the time they got there, they were panicking because they were their kind of supply lines were too tenuous now. And winter had come in. And the Chinese are panicking. They are about, from Chamdo to Lhasa, they are about at least 8 to 10 very high passes, all snowed in, all cold, all over 19,000 feet, It's like murderous. And the Chinese soldiers, many were deserting. Now we managed to get records. There was near mutiny from officers, young officers, who thought this was ridiculous. Mao Zedong himself was sending cables. People didn't know what they could do, and they were worried that the entire army might be wiped out in winter, So they didn't come anymore. So Tibetans managed to hold them back, even though the main Governor General had surrendered. For 5 more months, they held out. And then they started appealing. While they held out, our diplomats in Kalimpong and these areas, they started appealing to the United Nations. And then the British and the Indians at the time were totally kind of behaved in a very craven way, just like the British. I mean, Indians for other reasons. Nehru was, at that time the Prime Minister of India.
Right.
And he wanted to position himself as a leader of the, let's say, the Eastern kind of bloc, like of the Asian countries that had just been liberated from Western imperialists.
Right.
And he didn't want to annoy China. So the British and the Indians worked together to try to prevent, the issue of Tibet coming into General Assembly discussions. Finally, I think it was from El Salvador, their representative to the United States was quite a sophisticated, well-known diplomat. Um, I think his name was, I forget now, but he took up the Tibetan issue, and he said we had to, at the minimum, you have to have a discussion in the General Assembly. And so finally, that was a big day for the Tibetans. We were all hoping something's happening. But then the British, actually, because they were in the Security Council, they shot it down completely. With no, they just said it'll make things worse. And so that ended, and the Americans were actually not too sure. The Americans really did want to help Tibet out. There was some kind of sympathy. But the Americans were, if the British and the Indians who are the closest to the Tibetans, they are pulling back, and if nationalist Chinese, who are the enemies of the communist Chinese, are behaving in a hostile manner to Tibetans, then what the Americans were totally confused by all this. Although they did send representatives to Kalimpong, which is the frontier town between India and Tibet. Nonetheless, then, that was the last diplomatic kind of chance we had. And after 5 months, then Tibetans finally had to, sign a treaty with the Chinese, which the infamous 17-point treaty, which I won't go into because the Tibetans were completely taken for a ride, there. And I've written a full chapter about it in my book, and it was a complete con.
Which book? Well, you said your book. What's the title of the book?
No, this is a book I've written.
Okay. Yes.
It yet to be published. I'm negotiating.
Oh, okay. This is the one you mentioned to me the other day before we went on the air that you're working on.
It's called Echoes from Forgotten Mountains.
Yeah. Well, I would love to see you finish that book, and I would love to read it. But
publishers are finding it difficult to deal with it because it's very long. It's about 1,000 pages. But it deals with the entire, extent of the Tibetan resistance to the Chinese. So,
well, I think what you've done a masterful job of doing in a relatively short period of time is painting a picture for us that, if there's anybody out there who's sort of just beginning to get into this question and even remember that there used to be a Tibet that was separate from communist China, there's nothing about this story that you've just told us that remotely resembles liberating Tibet from anything, helping the Tibetan people, any of the other nonsense that Beijing puts out. I mean, this is straight up an invasion of an independent country by a hostile power. And as you've pointed out, while largely the world just watches and wrings its hands and does nothing. And, in the end, you can be the bravest people in the world and capable fighters and so forth. But there's only so much you're going to do when you're fighting a force that is so much bigger and so much more capable.
They had two divisions, the Chinese, actually, against Tibet. At least 50,000 people on their side. We had like 8,000. At the front, right at the front line, there was like this 20-1 difference. And I think that's one thing I find very offensive when people say, oh, the Tibetans, what chance they had? They were so kind of, and anyway, they were so outdated. This is like inevitable. No, these people fought. And I think it's something Tibetans should celebrate instead of feeling embarrassed, People win or lose.
Absolutely, they should. There's a lot of very courageous people who died defending their country, and anybody who has any question about what it meant to face the communist Chinese army should read about the U.S. experience in the Korean War. What happened
at the
Chosin Reservoir? The U.S. Marines will tell you. I mean, they killed a lot of Chinese. But they will tell you about one of the bitterest fights in the history of the United States Marine Corps. And those were American troops with a lot more in the way of equipment, numbers, and capability than the Tibetans ever had.
And they had, air support, artillery.
Absolutely. Tanks.
And this is what I had an argument with an American academic once, and he said, you Tibetans, as if, we just surrendered. And I said, the Chinese attack on the United Nations troop happened just 2 weeks after the invasion of Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what did you guys do?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the American, the term for it right now is the big bug out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Thousands and thousands of Americans just fled because of bad leadership. Later only they managed to regroup, and under a new commander, and after MacArthur had left,
Mm-hmm.
under a new commander, they managed to really fight back. But for a long, you just burnt their supplies and fled.
Well, there were entire American units around. I mean, the Marines ultimately came through relatively intact after hard fighting, but there were entire United States Army units that ceased to exist.
Yeah.
They just didn't any longer exist. Forget about taking casualties. Entire regiments that didn't exist anymore after that Chinese attack. So,
The thing was in Tibet, we are facing the same enemy.
right.
And we fought it. We just didn't flee. Nobody dropped their rifle.
Right.
One regiment, as I told you, was wiped out, but it was really wiped out. It was surrounded in the night, machine guns, mortars, and in the morning, like the old general, they managed to capture, but he had fought. Everyone else was dead there. We have eyewitnesses who talk about the whole area, just bodies frozen in the morning. Very scary sort of scene. But
Yes.
nobody just threw their weapons down and fled. That did not happen there in Tibet. And this is where I am trying to remind young Tibetans that these are people we have to remember.
Yes.
And we have to remember their stories. And I tell it in detail in my book. But this is one thing. And also, like, to be fair to the old Tibetan government, after they had surrendered the Chinese, they did reward all the sort of people who had fought heroically there. Some were given government official sort of ranks and titles. Juniors, and ordinary soldiers were given, cash awards and this. So whatever they did their bit, even after the surrender and the Chinese occupation army came to Tibet.
So, Jamyang, there's a whole second phase here, which is the armed resistance
Mm.
after the occupation. And I think probably you and I should address that in a whole separate episode because
Mhm.
I don't want to give that short shrift. I don't want to race through that because that's a whole nother story here.
And that's a very interesting
But
one.
if you could just set the stage for that just in a couple of minutes, and then again, I think we do that as a separate episode. So, the Dalai Lama, well, China, you've brought us to the point where the Chinese are now in control of all of Tibet. And
Mm.
as you say, there is an agreement signed, which is, I think, to be short, I'll give you my short version. It's like every other agreement that's signed at the point of a bayonet.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, it's a really bad deal because guess what? It's not an agreement. It's being dictated to you in some sense. So that's my short version. But there eventually begins an armed resistance of a different kind. In other words, not formal
hmm
military units, but if I can use the term, a guerrilla war against the Chinese. When does that start?
Now that started in some ways quite early on in a lot of, a lot of we had Tibet under the Lhasa government, they call it,
Right.
central Tibet. But a lot of Tibetan areas are already under the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Like large areas like Kham and Amdo, which in China would be the Qinghai province
Mm-hmm.
and Gansu province. These two provinces are Tibetan Mongol, you
Mm-hmm.
know, uh, with spiritual and cultural allegiance to central Tibet. And eastern Tibet, which is Sichuan province, and Yunnan, parts of Yunnan province, which also like their spiritual and their cultural allegiances are to central Tibet, the Dalai Lamas and the Tibetan world. And these areas, the uprisings started, and those were also in opposition to Chinese communist policies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important that, yeah, we discussed that at length. But it started actually like even before the invasion of Tibet, when the first communist troops got into let's say, Xining, the Chinese capital,
Mm-hmm.
Qinghai, the Tibetans there rose up against the Chinese, and they were very ferocious people with the reputation of ferocity.
Mm-hmm.
But just to get back to the treaty itself, it's very interesting because the Tibetans might have signed it under, the point, but all treaties signed by the losing side are always inside. There's a coercive element to it.
Of
Nobody was
course. Of
on the other
course.
side is signing of their own free will. But in
Yes.
the case of Tibet, the Tibetans managed actually to really make that treaty invalid. If you look at it, if anyone with any knowledge of international law studies that treaty, and the treaty, there are copies of it still, you can find it in Tibet also, it's in every way invalid. First of all, of course, it was done coercively, but that's another story. But the thing is, Tibetans officials who went there to sign this treaty, the Lhasa government told them not to take their seals of office there. And so only the governor general who had been captured, he had a seal. But then also he pretended he hadn't brought his seal with him because he didn't want to be the odd man out. So these Tibetans said, we don't have a seal, we can't sign that. So in Chinese, of course, they did a shortcut. They got a Beijing seal maker. The Chinese have their own seals. They got these ones
Right.
that are made with elephant, tusks, like ivory seals.
Mm-hmm.
They're not Tibetan. Tibetan ones are steel. And they just carve people's names on it. They're not seals at all by any kind of Tibetan seal, by any
Mm-hmm.
stretch imagining. And they cut them. And so the Tibetans always said these seals were forged. But the thing was, the Tibetans did not acknowledge these as their real seals.
Mm-hmm.
So you have one problem. The second problem, again, is when even the seals only just have the person's name.
Mm-hmm.
It does not have any designation, nothing.
Right.
And then Tibetans are told that you have to sign, and Tibetans didn't sign. Tibetans have a rich tradition of fluid signatures, Tibetans love calligraphy. It's an old world,
Mm-hmm.
So everyone has wonderful, but they refused. They all wrote down their names, just in block letters. And it doesn't pass a signature in any way.
Every way possible to make sure that anybody can understand this is not a real agreement and we're not really agreeing to anything.
So the Chinese actually had a problem with this. And they didn't want to raise this issue too much again because, there are earlier treaties with the British, and then you see it they were signed in Lhasa, the seal of the Dalai Lama, the seal of the cabinet, the seal of the National Assembly, Tibetan Parliament, the seal of the major monasteries, and all in different colors, and the signatures, and, the designation of those people, it's all there. And that's what you call a real treaty. But the Chinese one is very stark. So this issue can be raised again, and Tibetans should,
Right.
But so this is at the end of the day, that was the kind of problem. But the Chinese came in, and so into Lhasa, and they began, the occupation army gradually came in. And it's not only from eastern Tibet, that from the east the Chinese sent an army. They'd even sent an army from the west, from Xinjiang, from that area, on Bactrian camels. It was, from all sides the Chinese managed to do it.
So this is, I think, a good point to break for this episode, because we're going to transition now. Just to be clear, for the people that are listening to this and are, who are having their eyes opened, hopefully, to this history that unfortunately a lot of people are not taught. What year is this now? Where are we in time?
We are at the end of 1950, and the Chinese occupation army, after many months, when finally the Tibetans had to give up and sign the treaty, then they started coming in the summer of 51. They started coming into Tibet. I was in Lhasa as a baby in 1950 and had just left just when the Chinese army reached the frontier of Tibet. My mother took, and some of my relatives, we left Tibet. I was a 2-year-old baby and really have no memories. But
and your family, I assume, went to India, like so many other Tibetans did.
Yes.
All right. I think that's a perfect point to break for today, because I think that takes us through this first phase of it. Thank you very much for giving us the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Ground Truth.